But thank you, Christy. Thank you, everyone, for showing up. I really do appreciate it. I did say this earlier, but for those of you who may have just walked in with us, if you're really expecting me to answer this question today, I'm sorry, I probably won't give you a definitive answer. But what we are going to do is take a look at what the literature tells us about the impacts of instructor facilitation in online discussion. So let me just start with a really quick question. Okay, for those of you who teach online or for those of you who support teaching online, do you have, maybe a common question or a common theme that comes up in terms of online discussion if you talk to, let's say, your students or you read student evals? What do students say about instructor participation in online discussion? What do they say, Christy?
Our students say they really like knowing that the instructor is there and willing to interact with them, and that's where they feel like our teaching takes place.
Mm-hmm. Sure. They like to know that the instructor is there and the instructor is facilitating learning. What happens in those entirely rare and unheard of instances where the instructor does not participate in the discussion? What do students say and how do they react to that? What do they say to us? They say, it feels like what? It feels like I was what, class? I was teaching what? Myself. Yes, very good. It feels like I was teaching myself, and there's your Ferris Bueller moment for the day. So we do know this. We know this is how students react to these things. But what else do we know, and what else can we glean from the literature to tell us about this? First of all, let's start by situating this conversation, as we do most of the time when we talk about online learning, in the community of inquiry framework, which, by the way, is now 18 years old, interestingly. Garrison, Anderson, and Archer began defining this in 2000. I know most of us are familiar with this, but again, it's worth talking about because really we're kind of talking about perhaps all three zones today. We're talking about the instructor's effect as a facilitator, but we're also talking about how the instructor can potentially elicit critical thinking as evidence of cognitive presence. And really the instructor's social presence, as we just talked about. Is the instructor there and perceived as a real person? So where we're going to really start and where we're going to spend most of our time in this discussion today is really talking about what the literature has said when it's looked at instructor presence in relation to facilitating online discussion. And Garrison et al. Defined these three key tasks related to instructor presence. Instructional design, which in Garrison's context means selecting and organizing the course content and the learning activities and the assessment activities. A somewhat more constricted view of what instructional design is for those of us who are practitioners. Facilitating discourse, typically as we've seen via online discussion. And really direct instruction, those moments where there needs to be instructor to student transmission of knowledge, okay? Drilling down a little bit more now into this aspect of facilitating discourse. These are the dimensions that Garrison defined in terms of what really the key activities of an instructor should be in an online discussion. And what you really can kind of see about this, if you really look at this, is we're really saying the instructor is a facilitator. The instructor is a moderator, right? In the middle of this discussion, a mediator potentially. But there are those opportunities when the discussion goes off tracks potentially that the instructor reframes the conversation, readdresses and brings people back and potentially brings in other sources and other knowledge. I throw in this footnote just because there's been a little bit more recent rearrangement and recategorization of what these tasks look like that's also worth looking at. It looks just somewhat different from this. Another way to think about faculty participation is to sort of this bifurcated approach here of academic content and non-academic content. And if we think about this, the non-academic content can often, truly, in many studies, occupy a good percentage of the instructor's time. Messaging things about the administrative tasks of the course, deadlines, assignment criteria. The instructor can do some positive reinforcement to students, right? Not necessarily validating their learning as much as validating themselves as a fellow human being in the affective domain. And this other dimension is really interesting that Garrison and Arbaugh called other. And I had to throw in a paren for it even to make sense to me, because other tends to be those other kinds of messages that we might interject as evidence of our own personality and our own interests. You know, so you might, for instance, say, Happy Memorial Day on Memorial Day. Or you might acknowledge that we finally got into spring and the weather is great. So they're more of those social aspects. And on the other side, the dimensions that the instructor might often engage in terms of, focusing on the academic content. What's interesting is a lot of the research talks about the fact that really facilitating critical inquiry should be based on the Socratic method, but a lot of the studies found the faculty really don't do a great job at engaging in this. And in some studies, faculties have self-reported, well, it's because it really takes time. It's a difficult thing for me to do, as the course is a moving object, day to day, week to week, to really continually reframe inquiry with students. So, it's not surprising then that a lot of what we see is we start with that interrogative, that starting question, and then the discussion moves forward from there with a greater or lesser degree of instructor facilitation, really depending, I think, upon instructor preference and instructor time commitment in terms of what we see. So many times then what instructors do engage in, a lot of what the lit tells us, is providing additional information to students to build out from where they are in that discussion board, or again, correcting misperceptions if need be. So this study was interesting to me simply because they created metrics in the study trying to gauge, the timeliness of instructor intervention and the responsiveness. But ultimately, it wasn't totally useful to me in this study because there was absolutely no correlation then to student satisfaction. So it was a measure that was kind of hanging out there in space and not terribly useful. We've talked just a little bit now about some of the challenges. Many studies identify other challenges along the way. And really one of the key things that you'll see thematically in many of these studies that I'm going to highlight today is this challenge that the instructor does become the sage on the stage, right? The instructor tends to unintentionally take over and overpower the discussion and potentially shut down further student dialogue. And on the student side, although we tend to really promote the benefits of asynchronous learning, right? It's time and space independent, there's time for reflection. I thought that was a super quote from that, right? That students feel like it's a message in a bottle. They put it out there, it floats away, maybe somebody gets to it and reads it, maybe somebody doesn't. So for students, there can be a disconnect in that lack of immediacy. So this is kind of a somewhat older study. I think this is 2002, and I have to say that just because as we go forward, we're going to be looking at newer studies that begin to contradict some of these points right here, okay? So Rovai in this particular study suggested that faculty read the discussion board daily. I think that's a really good advice. And as he said, post once a day to suggest that messages are being read. And I think that's a really interesting comment, right? You're acknowledging that messages are being read. And if you think about it, and maybe you've done this in your own course, ways in which you can do that are not necessarily within the discussion board. But while a discussion is ongoing, you can go to your announcements and you can say, hey, this week in this discussion as we're going through, I really want to point out the fact that Andrea and Stan have taken excellent counter arguments, and I want you to read both of them and think about it, right? Right? And we know, Stan, we know you guys, you do it all the time. It's really sickening. I wish you'd stop. But it is a way to affirm and recognize those student contributions without commenting directly on it. And personally, as a learner, when that's happened, I won't do this because I'll pound on the mic, but you do this, right? You feel good. You feel good because you've been acknowledged by the instructor, and you want to participate more naturally. So that kind of a strategy, doing a summarization, right? I mean, these are not exactly rocket science ideas, but I think they're important that they were highlighted in here as strategies. I love the title of this particular study, right? Sage, Guide, or Ghost, because there's the extreme, and those are the extremes that students will comment on in feedback at the end of the course. Now, here's where things start to get muddy, and this is why I think this is really interesting as you spend time in the lit. In this particular study, there's kind of a reverse correlation between instructor posting and student responses. So in other words, the more the instructor posted, student responses began to decline, okay? And again, what you're looking at is the instructor is the authoritative source. So students tend to damp down, and students then may tend to feel, oh, I may not really have the right answer. I'm not so sure. I better wait and see. The instructor will tell me what the right answer is. Okay, so that happens, and that begins to muddy things up as well. What's interesting is in this particular study, students responded faster to their peers than they did to the instructor. So they were really forming, I think, a community of practice and helping each other in that respect. This, I thought, was super fascinating because, okay, we've just talked about all those negatives, the way students reacted to it, but students felt instructors who posted more often were more enthusiastic and more expert, okay? So students are really saying contradictory things to us about their expectations, which is not surprising. Within this study, again, you see a very similar effect to what we just saw in the other one, where the more the instructor posts within the forum, the lower the amount of student posts happen. But again, okay, note this point right there. The quality of student postings was the same, regardless of whether the instructor participated in the discussion or not. Isn't that interesting? Okay. But again, sampling out from another different study where students were polled, okay, students prefer the instructor in there because he or she is the SME, the subject matter expert. So taking this up a little bit now and talking really more about social presence, about the sense of community that students feel. This is a pretty recent study. This just came out at the end of 2017, University of Toronto, Graduate School of Education, and it's an interesting study. It's a little hard to generalize simply because it occurred during an accelerated winter term. And I think that's important to note because I think the effects can be different in an accelerated term. So what was happening in this particular scenario, there were two courses in parallel, one where the discussion was purely student facilitated, and in the other section, discussion was instructor facilitated. So there tended to be, in the student facilitated group, actually a more sense of cohesion from the students, despite what I just said in the bullet there. But what was happening was the students were generating more material overall in the peer facilitated course. And again, this is a little quirky because of the learning management system that they were using. I mean, students can create almost like a private notebook in this system. So students were creating more private notes and generating more content on their own to help them learn, apparently, in that scenario. Instructor communication was still high in that peer facilitated course, but it was happening one-to-one behind the scenes via email. So it's not like it went away, it went into a different channel. So that's kind of a confound when you look at this study carefully and you think about what's going on. But again, even in this accelerated term, students really, in essence, felt that there was more community created when the instructor was facilitating discussion, and they created more content within the discussion area when an instructor was facilitating. So it's a curious study. I just actually wrote a critical reaction paper to it, so that's why it's still fresh in my mind. So really, of course, we ask ourselves, well, then what is appropriate? When should an instructor really participate? When should the instructor intervene? In this particular study, again, what you're seeing is a negative correlation between instructor intervention and the amount of content students are generating. But I think this is a kind of a key finding right here, okay? Those instructors who then chose to provide a summary, a wrap-up experience at the end of that thread actually were scoring higher on student evaluations in terms of instructor enthusiasm, okay? So again, factoring out whether or not the instructor was posting during the discussion period, if the instructor posted at the end to help coalesce everyone's thinking and summarize and bridge, then that actually was perceived as more positive instructor behavior. Now, this one I actually ran into literally yesterday as I was finishing this, because this was just published last month. So I pulled the article down via interlibrary loan to take a look at this. And what's interesting about this article, and I really would encourage you to go read this one, is that the authors make a case that there hasn't been a lot of research to date on comparing the effectiveness of instructor versus peer facilitation in online discussion forums. And there's a really, really good lit review in this that makes that case. So I think this study alone is worth consideration and looking at. And what we're seeing in this, and let me explain what this language means in here, okay? What is a redirect? So again, you sort of have an A-B treatment. You have instructor facilitation, you have peer facilitation, okay? And this is in a debate scenario. So students within the group are basically, you're picking a side, you're pro or you're con. And they go through a certain time period of doing the debate exercise on those two positions, and then a third position is brought in, okay? So this is really kind of like the muddiest point. So we're going from a very clear A-B type of discussion, and now here's a confounding factor that's presented to them. Now, that's what they mean by redirect in this study, okay? So what matters in this study was who presented that redirect, who made that challenge, okay? If the instructor made that challenge to their thinking, it didn't generate the same amount of student posts as if a student had presented it. In a student doing that facilitation and presenting that counter argument, it created, measured in this study, measured by the type of posts that students were creating. So looking at really the 4 dimensions of critical thinking, there was more evidence of the 3rd and 4th order in the posts from the peer facilitated group. So that in and of itself is in another intriguing finding.
I would say there's a psychology to that.
Okay.
When the instructor is posting, they take it as, oh, it's the instructor, so.
Exactly.
So there's a psychology there.
Exactly. There is that.
Which would impede their, I actually kind of do a model of both. I
Right.
enable like ratings.
Yeah.
And so what I do is I'll go in and rate it, but I don't post until the end.
Right. And so again, I agree with that completely, that I think, as my critical reading of these studies, is in fact what you are seeing is that sort of dampening effect of the instructor as the authoritarian source. And so that then brings us to this, okay? So that being the case, what can I tell you? What can I suggest to you that you should do differently or more or less? You know, what all those studies seem to suggest to me is that an instructor should be somewhat judicious in terms of the actual frequency of posting in a forum. And I mean, have you ever had this question when you're working with a new faculty member? And one of the first questions they do ask you is, well, how often should I post in a discussion forum, right? And what do you say? What's your answer? What do you suggest as guidance? It depends, right? Faculty discretion. What else? Come on, you guys are wimps. What else?
That instructors kill discussions.
Instructors kill discussions. Yeah, and that can happen too, right? Sure. Doug.
Well, you know what I tend to say, because you heard me
We don't.
say, but
They don't know. He works for me, so.
I actually go through a lot of what's covered in this in terms of explaining the advantages and disadvantages. So I tell them, you know, one of the issues is you can shut down the discussion, but I try to get them to think about what are the factors, what are they looking for out of the discussion, what are they looking for in terms of the rules and regulations surrounding the discussion. Is it post once, two responses, which is not official measure anyways. And I actually tend to push them to try to encourage the more of the peer debate.
Right.
model.
Again, trying to suggest a peer strategy. Yes.
Yeah, well, I tend to do it at the end also. What
Sure.
I tend to do is I let them do all of their discussion, and then I don't, and it's all in multiple threads and stuff, so I only pick if they've missed something I think they should know,
Mm-hmm.
and I'll post the fill-ins.
Right. Exactly.
And the other thing is if there's something that or something they didn't consider, I will put that in, and that sometimes actually generates another discussion.
Yeah, and that's actually, in a way, sort of back to that previous study, that, you know, that clarifying point, bringing in something else to the students. So bringing in things they may not have covered, or acting in that summary function, as we saw in guidance from some of those other studies out there.
Just say, hey, this is good.
Right. Well, I mean, to me, that is the challenge of it all, you know, in terms of what that level is. Yes.
I'm just wondering how you deal with incivility between the students.
Incivility. I mean, that tends to be, well, let's say this. I mean, we tend to encourage our students to sort of create, you know, the code of conduct in the class. We actually have a document that's typically called My Expectations. And within that, we do have very standard language that says, we expect this to be, you know, a civil discourse. You can agree or disagree with each other, but in a respectful manner. So, you know, highlighting those things back in the old days, we used to call that netiquette. It's still applicable, you know. You can go out and Google something on netiquette and adapt that to your needs, because that way you've got something to frame with students. If they do begin to drift, you can bring them back. Now, the other thing that's interesting about that, just parenthetically, is, I mean, that can be really interesting, and you've probably seen this in courses where the topics can be sensitive. You know, we've had a long-running course on race in society. It's a sociology course. And the instructor said, you know, I've taught this course in person in a long time, and it's hard to get students to talk about this in person. But online, he found the discussion, in fact, was that much more richer, that much more nuanced, because, you know, you're not sitting there looking each other in the eye and saying something potentially uncomfortable. So, yes.
Well, the other issue that they're finding is for students to be able to tell the tone of a person writing, and that's a huge thing with online discussion,
Yeah.
especially with certain courses that deal with topics such as race or
Exactly.
anything like that. And we had made a suggestion to one professor who was having that concern about possibly integrating some online meeting, like a Zoom meeting, where they have those discussions. Granted, that puts you face to face again, but that kind of
Right.
takes that whole, well, what do they mean by this when they write
Right,
this?
and the other
We
thing
don't
about,
have that.
you know, the other way you can address if you're really concerned about tone is, you know, if you look at something like voice thread, if you look at something that, again, it's still asynchronous, but now you're really getting the verbal from students. Yes,
One last thing, I make it clear that every group should have a devil's advocate. There is somebody, you need to have someone who is willing to ask the hard questions that other people do not want to ask, because you can't look at the world from just one perspective. And
Right.
I'm very clear in my instructions. You gotta have, you know,
sure,
so
having
that it
multiple
has to be,
perspectives,
you know,
right.
and that brings
Exactly.
perspective.
I'm gonna go here next.
Yeah, so I teach at a community college, and the first few weeks are always a little bit of a struggle, because I give them prompts on what to talk about, and I might have some of my stronger students might write a whole page or two even on a topic, and then there's the students who write about 3 to 4 sentences, and we're not even sure what the topic's about even at that point in time. So I feel an obligation to come in and explain to them that it's not a high-level post and that they need to do this, that, and the next thing. So I don't know, any way I can't, you know, so less might be more, but if I do less, they'll do even less.
That's true.
So I have that kind of struggle, and then there's the flip side, is the ones who write 2 pages of wonderful text, and you pop it into Google, and it turns out it was just a
It wasn't
Wikipedia
theirs,
article.
right. Right, it was a great statement written by somebody else. So, I mean, I'm going to come to summary here to bring us to conclusion, because we are coming down, but I appreciate all your thoughts on this. So some of those things that are the difficulties in these studies, and this is why I would encourage you to go read them, is ask yourself at what level of performance is the study occurring. Is this in a community college? Is this a comprehensive? Is this a graduate course? Because I do think you're going to see very different behaviors in terms of student performance, and their expectation for what they expect from the instructor is very different. Again, from our very last study that we looked at, I think this is an area of further exploration that I really would like to see more studies looking at in terms of this comparative. Can we say one is better? Can we say peer facilitation is better in some ways, or in some cases, or in some treatments? I think we need more studies done on that to answer that question for us. So, how are we doing, Christy, on time? 3 minutes. Okay, so we'll take a couple more. Tom.
So my question was actually about what you just said, because for me, one of the nuggets to kind of take out of this is that the best practice would be this redirect.
Yes.
You know, that difference that was seen between the student and the instructor redirect. And I was wondering if there was anything in the literature that you read as far as any kind of strategies to foster that, whether that was kind of an organic outcome or it was something that was, like someone mentioned, you know, assigning a devil's advocate.
Yeah, and I think in that last study, it really seems to me that they did assign a student to that particular role to manage that. And, you know, perhaps that is an answer, because then you've delegated that responsibility to somebody. I'm not clear. All of this really you can read through this multiple times and see what you can pull out of it yourself. So I don't really know that I saw an answer to that. Yes?
Can I offer one more suggestion? Sure. I actually use grading rubrics. And I tell them, go look at the rubric, it's in the instructions, and I tell them they're supposed to have 3 paragraphs, what it's got to include.
Right.
So you know, obviously you're always going to have students who don't read the instructions,
Right.
don't look at the grading rubric,
And,
but I mean,
and within the context
that's
of the
how
rubric too, we
that
can
problem
really
of
be
getting them.
right.
I told them up front, if they don't do all this, they're
Sure.
not going to get full credit.
You could be explicit in the rubric in terms of talking about those 4 dimensions of critical thinking and what they look like, and give them an example so that they could really understand that modeling up front. So I do think that's another way to approach it. Chrissy.
I used to tell instructors to stay out of discussions because that was what we used to tell people. Now I give them the answer that they all hate is you have to read the room and figure out, a lot of them want a straight up answer, should I or shouldn't I?
Right.
Sometimes some of the classes will have 8 people in them and have 200 posts.
Right.
That type of thing. Some of them will not even do that. So they have to figure, and it might be different between discussions as well. So they have to read
In
through.
sections of the
So
same
again,
course.
I think, you know, we started with this statement, and I think we'll end on this statement, and the statement is, it depends. And as instructional designers, we're all very comfortable saying that. So, so thank you for coming today. I hope this is informative. I really enjoyed the dialogue with you. As I said, The presentation itself is out here on SlideShare. The actual bibliography of all the sources that I referred to is out here on a Google Doc. Do take a look at this as well. I just borrowed somewhat from this. University of Central Florida's online teaching repository. They built their own bibliography to help faculty in making these decisions about discussion facilitation. That's also a great resource. So I think we're out of time. So thank you all so much.